I didn't hear the announcer, but it looks like it's recording. Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming to the July 6th edition of the SIG Network meeting. As usual, this is under the Kubernetes Code of Conduct, which effectively boils down to be nice to one another. So please do be nice to one another. And as you can, use the hand raise feature in Zoom if you have questions or need to interject so that we can keep things flowing. We have a reasonably small agenda for today. If you're here and you have any other agenda items that you'd like to have discussed, you may add them to the bottom. It's an open agenda. And if we're able to get to them here, we will. Otherwise, they can flood over into the next meeting. But I think we'll have time for a couple more items given what we have. All right, so let's get started. We'll go through triage. My basic plan is we go through the unassigned triage items for now, and then go through the agenda. And if we have time at the end, come back for the assigned triage items that are kind of stuck. If anybody has an objection to that, please let me know, or wants to raise a specific triage item, please let me know. Hopefully you can see my screen. All right, starting at the oldest unassigned triage issue first. Default value for service IP family policy, not right. I created a headless service without a selector. The API server set default value for service spec IP family equals required dual stack, but my cluster is single stack.
This is Tim.
Yep, sorry. So the KEP does say that it will use prefer dual stack, and the implementation says it will use require dual stack. It doesn't actually matter because it's going to set both families anyway in that one special case. So the question, there's two questions then. One is it worth changing it to match the KEP? I don't think so at this point. It's a feature that's out there. I don't think changing the semantics has any meaningful result. The downside of that is if they, as the user said, they change it back and they added a selector to it, and now it's no longer falling into that special case, and the required dual stack is going to fail because they don't have a dual stack cluster. We could fix it up in the case that they make that modification. We have some other places where we do special case changing of various, like the service type. But in general, I think that's just kind of gross. And so this seems niche enough that my opinion is we should say this is just not worth fixing. The amount of energy involved here is too high for something that seems like a relatively rare case. If suddenly 100 people pop up saying, oh, I do this all the time and here's why, then we could look at it.
So wait, what is your argument for not switching it to prefer?
That it's already out there as require, and it wasn't clear to me that switching it to prefer while leaving the families as dual stack will actually be correct anyway. So if we switch it to prefer instead of require, it's still going to publish both families in that special case of headless selectorless, right? Now they add a selector, both families are still present, which isn't what would happen if they had just created that service from scratch, right? So it's already suspect and falling into this weird dubious corner case. So we would need to add code that says you're switching it from headless plus selectorless, that one weird corner case, into a non-weird corner case, and then we need to rerun through the allocator logic to figure out which families to assign you in which order. Like,
so what are the? I mean, what happens if you prefer dual stack and you specify two families, but the cluster only has one service sider? Isn't that the same?
It's an error. Yeah, it's an error too, right?
That's an error?
Yeah.
My question is, you can still create. This is about defaulting, right? You can still create your headless service as you want.
Yes.
Because I think that we went through this discussion and like for days on what to choose, and
Yes.
we decided, oh, let's do it dual stack. That's the no
Yeah, I remember
thing
this
that
argument.
covers everything.
I mean, so to Dan's question, we could maybe, I have to think really hard about it. We could maybe say prefer dual with explicit families set is allowable. It just doesn't mean anything. It would give a slight boost in like portability, I guess. You could say prefer dual, set the order that you want, and then have that in your YAML. I'm not sure that I'm actually, I would have to go back and refresh on that whole code
But
path.
I think the argument was because it was headless without selector. So we say, oh, the user can do whatever they want.
That's right. So headless without selector, we're like, all we can do is say you're allowed to have both, and we can't control it. But now they're saying they update it from headless selectorless to just headless with a selector. And at that point, it would follow the usual validation, which would now fail.
And then we step back and say, oh, maybe required was too hard, and let's do prefer. And it seems that we follow up only in the cap. And I remember the headless without selector is, oh, you can do whatever you want.
That's right. That's explicitly, there's like a block of code that's like, this is a weird corner case. We just handle it this way. I would be, now that you asked this, Dan, I would be okay with exploring switching it to prefer if we're okay with prefer allowing both families, but I don't know what the implication of that would be. I'd have to think really hard about that.
Yeah, as you're talking about this, I'm remembering the discussions more, and I don't really remember the details enough either.
I mean, fortunately, we commented the crap out of that code because we all figured it out once and we're like, let's write it down. So the code is pretty, in my opinion, reasonably easy to follow, but the test cases are voluminous, and so we'd have to like make the change and see about it. So let me update this one since I was updating it before. I'll say this here. I don't have bandwidth in the near term future to make this change, but if somebody wanted to explore it, it seems like it's at least worth trying. And if it doesn't work out, then like if it's a huge amount of effort to do, I don't think we should do it. But if it was actually straightforward, then maybe okay.
Okay.
I'll update this
So
one.
you're gonna pick it up or follow up on it.
I'll assign myself and follow up on it.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you everybody for the discussion. Next one up is from Dan. Meaning of sync proxy rules IP tables total given minimize IP tables restore. Dan, do you want to just go ahead and?
So Antonio and I are discussing there, but I realized that the minimize IP tables restore thing sort of broke one of our metrics, because we used to have this metric of the total number of IP tables rules that kube proxy creates, and now it's just the total number of IP tables rules that kube proxy created the last time it called IP tables restore, which you know, who knows. And we're trying to figure out, like, is that still useful? Is it less useful? Is it more useful?
Yeah, I think that is the number of rules that it programs. So you can infer there is another metric that gives you programming latency or something like that. So you can know if your rules, you have the rules, the IP table restore should take less time. Why did you think
When
that?
did we break this?
What?
When did we break this?
So over the last few releases, we've merged in a change that causes the IP tables kube proxy to not rewrite rules that haven't changed.
It's
Right.
like partial. No, it's, how did you call it? Only program that change the rules that change it. It's really cool.
I'm I'm not sure I'm following exactly. It's so we had a metric.
So
We had a
that
metric that counted
changed.
all the rules, and now we only
Counted all
count
the
the
rules.
now we only count the incremental rules because Dan
Mm.
was clever and did an incremental update.
So the thing is, you have a queue process reconciles every X seconds, right? And it takes all the services and everything and create all the rules. With this, it just is smart enough to say, only these things change it. So I'm only going to program the things that change it, not all the rules. And
So I
because
guess
the metric was counting the rules, the total number of rules, now is in this partial updates, is only counting the number of partial rules.
yeah.
But I argue that that's valuable because you know the rules that you are counting in each iteration.
I
not
get
the
what's
total number.
happening. My
Okay.
question is what version? Yeah, sorry, I didn't have any confusion about what was happening. My apologies.
Okay, sorry.
My question, which I think is prudent, is what version did we change it in? Or did we change it
I
yet? in
think
any
it
version?
went beta in 1.26.
Oh, so
And
it's been changed for a minute. Because if it hadn't been out yet, obviously we'd probably want to, fix it. But the fact that it's been kind of out there for a little bit suggests that maybe people didn't notice that it changed or like didn't care. So both of you are kind of, it sounds like Antonio's in favor of the new behavior. Am I
No,
understanding?
I'm saying
correctly?
that is consistent with the meaning.
Yeah,
So
it's interesting.
Zuri just said on chat, maybe add a second metric there. So part of the problem is that it is now very difficult to count what the original value would have been because we're just not actually doing the work that would let us know that. And we could do it. I talked about that some, but the question is,
is the way forward here then just to document or better document this change and then?
I hate to be the pain in the butt, but I think the metric means what it means, and changing it is a bad thing. And even if it's difficult,
what does it mean?
It says the number of IP tables rules programmed. I would assume that means all of them.
And I'm kind of,
So
that's
why
where I started out. I started with thinking,
Okay.
well, we got to know when this broke or changed because ideally we don't change anything like that. It's certainly not a good behavioral pattern to get into. This one instance may be reasonably.
What we will see is, normally we'll see the incrementals, and so it'll be a small number, and then we'll hit one of those cases where you were like, fall back on the full path, right? And you'll see this huge spike in your metric, and then it'll go right back down, and people will wonder what the heck is going on with this metric. It becomes not a useful metric.
Why not?
The timing metric has the same property, right?
That is the thing that I don't agree. Why don't you see the benefits? So you can see, I have this time, I have worse performance because I programmed 1,000 rules, and in these steps I'm programming only 50 or
because
20.
it's not documented as this is the number of rules programmed the last time we ran our incremental sync. It's programmed. It's documented as the number of rules programmed.
Right, in each moment.
I see both perspectives. I see Antonio and Dan's perspective of like, so technically this is valuable this way and stuff like that. But Tim's perspective is also accurate. It's like, we don't want to just randomly change fiddly things for people. That's not a Kubernetes that we want to ship people, where things just kind of that they expect it to work a certain way just change without notice, even if they're smaller. It's a balancing act.
Dan, I've lost track of exactly how hard it would be to calculate this. Is it like really, really hard, or just like, what a pain in my butt hard?
If we want to calculate the exact number, then we basically need to remove the short circuit from sync proxy loop and have it go through the second half of the loop, but not actually write the rules, just count them. And that would be a little bit ugly, but it wouldn't be difficult. There are other things we could do to get an approximate number.
But would the performance be the same? if you added the
Yeah,
second.
no, that wouldn't hurt performance because the performance comes from giving those rules to IP tables, not from the computing them part.
Yeah, and honestly, that code is fairly heavily optimized in terms of memory allocations and stuff already, so it's not going to be too bad.
So then let me try to understand. So what you're saying is the number of rules that exist on the data plane. That's the metric that you want.
Yes,
And
that's what it was traditionally.
Okay, but you see the comment that I added is the number of IP table rules that the proxy installs. So I understand it as the proxy at that moment installs these rules.
It is ambiguously worded, and there's value in both interpretations. So I would support adding whichever one we interpret this to be. I would support adding the other one because they're both sort of interesting. But you know, Dan, ultimately this is going to fall on you. If you say this is just too much of a pain in the ass to implement, I won't push too hard.
My question is, what is the benefit of knowing how many IP table rules do you have in the data plane?
I don't think we can really ask that question because we have to just kind of assume that somebody has a benefit somewhere, right? Like when you have little bits like this that you make part of your public.
We added it in the first place because I recall at some point some bug that ended up like adding a lot of extra rules, and we said, uh-oh, if we'd had a metric that had suddenly gone up by 2 or 3x, we would have noticed it.
Ah, that's a good point. Yeah,
but
then
we have a unit test for that now as well. So
that's a good unit test, right? No, I agree now.
Okay, I can add. I can revert this back to the previous behavior and add a second metric for the new behavior. It's not that hard.
All right, if you take a look at it and you decide, oh, I was wrong, it really is that hard, then let's bring it back and have a discussion. But if it's really not super complicated, then I think the compatibility is better.
Okay, sorry. All right. Next up, thank you all for that great discussion. Thank you, Dan, who I think this falls on quite a bit. Moving on, we have a multiple concerns with network policies from last week. I didn't read this one. I saw some of the other ones, but I haven't seen this one yet. It's from the audit report. Network policy object provides a flexible manner. Let's see if anybody's looked at this yet. I think it did.
Assigned to network policy API working group. Tell them to make sure they keep this in mind.
You can assign it to me. I don't think there's a network policy label, I think, but
there is area network policy.
Yeah, but I'll triage it.
You got it. Thank you.
So Shane, right. you should be able to do /area.
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
Network policy with a dash, I believe. Yep.
You said that and it slipped my mind right as you were saying it. Cool. Here we go. Thank you for shepherding that one forward, Andrew.
No problem.
Dan, rewrite test under temporary network failure to use NF tables.
This is just something that came out of the NF tables cap. There are some test cases that explicitly call IP tables to ruin the network to see how things cope with it, and we should add NF table support to those at some point. So I just filed this, hoping that somebody would pick it up someday.
Should we just triage accept it then?
Sure.
Is it that simple? Node local DNS not working with custom hosts. I haven't seen this one either, actually. EKS 122 after installing Node local DNS. In-cluster DNS and external DNS work normally, but custom hosts stored in core DNS config map stop working. Is anybody taking a look at it? Paco did.
No, I think he tagged on it. But the problem is there was several EKS in the past that they have some network stack that is different.
You're saying in EKS there's been some some odd networking issues related to DNS?
I don't know. I know that in the past we pinged teams to try to get someone.
Roger that.
So
So then
I really don't know the stack. I know that we had 2 issues and they went through teams and put some people from AWS to check.
Roger that. Okay. So if anybody on the call, it sounds like this one is in a situation where it just needs somebody who has familiarity with EKS to actually take the time to go try to reproduce it / understand it so that we can figure out what the approach is here. Does anybody want to pick that up? All right. If not, I'll take it. I don't think I'll be the one to actually drive it forward, but I'll see if I can find somebody who can. All right, failure cluster. DNS should provide DNS services.
This is a job that they set up with the hack local cluster thing. And, you can assign to me. So it's
Okay.
most probably something with the environment. They are migrating clusters to jobs to an AWS cluster, and some of the configuration needs to be tuned because they have a lot of hard code. I will follow up. No, give it.
Okay, thank you. All right, what time are we at? Oh, almost 30 after. Might as well just hit this last one real quick and then we'll go into the rest of our agenda. Sonatillo, TCP contract remains unreplied when pod is deleted, causing traffic loss. Let's see if anybody took a look at this one yet. Antonio,
I think that Lars and I went through this in another duplicate issue. And I think that is because people is using MetaLV or this kind of things to implement load balancers. So they have external traffic policy local being received in nodes that doesn't have pods, right? And then they have all these black holing problems. But I mean, I think Lars, do you volunteer to be assigned with me to this? Because we went through there. Okay.
Yeah, but it also that they are reusing the same source port. And in my opinion, that is a very unusual case in TCP that I'm unsure if it should be supported in every case.
Just confirming you're okay with being volunteered. So is that cool? Lars? Okay. If you want yourself off of there, take yourself off there. Sounds like we were okay.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it. Cool. All right. So that covers everything that was unassigned. Let's go back to the agenda for today. We have a few items and we should get started on them because we're at halfway point. I think it's Cesare. Want to go ahead and talk about service?
One thing.
Oh, sorry, code freeze. I missed the code freeze.
Right.
Yeah, sorry. So there's code freeze Wednesday, 19th of July. So coming right up around the corner. The link is here. And there's the 128 cycle information and stuff like that. But just so people are aware. Did anybody else want to say anything else about the code freeze?
I know there's a lot of PRs open. I'm trying furiously to work through it. I am also on vacation in 2 weeks. So I'm here this week and next, and then and the Monday after, and then I'm out. So that's my own deadline.
Roger that. So make some noise
So,
if you have something.
Yeah, don't be shy is what I'm really saying.
Ring the bells and such. Okay, moving on. Cesare, you want to talk about your service health item here?
Yeah, so if you can open this in the tab,
Yep.
maybe, and show the. Thank you. So we're trying to add a header in kubeproxy service that returns health check for services with external traffic policy local. And as Dan pointed out, this information which we want to put in the header is already present in the body. So from our point of view, it's like we have a load balancers that require a header with a HTTP header with a number of endpoints to correctly utilize this information for weighted load balancing, and it also seems like easier to parse from the load balancer point of view if it's in the header other than JSON decoding on the load balancer side, and also like the header name. I have not seen that anywhere outside our company, but it looks generic enough so other providers could use it. So yeah, that's the proposal. If you go to the maybe files changed, and there is like tiny change of files plus some tests, some of them were missing. I think that the latter, the second file is definitely. This is the test, and then just this one header.
Okay. So I'm biased, so I'm looking for people to argue with me, and I'm happy to be argued with. This seems reasonable to me. I get the argument that parsing a header is easier than parsing an arbitrary JSON body. The name is ostensibly generic. If somebody came along and said, we want the same capability, but we don't like the header name, I would not object to making it a configurable thing if we had to. I just wouldn't start with it as a flag. Or even adding multiple headers if we needed slightly different formats or something. Like, as long as they're ostensibly general and it's not like, you know, X Google something, I'm pretty much okay with it. It seems reasonable to me anyway. So, but that said, I know who my employer is. So somebody who's not a Googler, feel free to argue with me.
Please.
I mean, I'm the one who said, oh, we should put it in the, or it's already in the JSON, but I also accept the argument that the header is easier for load balancers to parse. So.
And do you know any other provider that has this feature? I was trying to look for some public documentation. I think Azure has a similar feature, but it's statically configured for the endpoints, and I'm not sure it covers AKS. So it's not like there is no race between providers to provide such header. We are the only one that needs that. It's generic enough, and we can in the future replace it with a flag if you want.
It also reminds me of the discussion about adding support for head calls on probes. Like, it seems plausible that, you know, some load balancer implementation may one day say we only call head on our probes or on our health checks, and so having it in the header also makes sense. I don't think we support that explicitly in kubeproxy, but maybe Go's default HTTP implementation supports head automatically, I think.
Doesn't it?
I think it does, maybe.
So the other thing that I might argue here is that we currently have no documentation of how the health check node ports work. And in fact, the how to write a service proxy document that I wrote says just copy the code out of KK because that is the specification. So it'd be great if we could formally document this, especially if we're adding new functionality that people are going to be depending on.
Would you mind dropping that as a, or I guess he's heard it, but if you want, you could drop it as a comment in there too. And I guess that can be kind of the next thing as we get, it sounds like this is mostly non-controversial. We get some tests and some documentation and we're good. Is that about right? Ta-da. Okay. So that sounds like, I'm sorry if I've been messing up your name. Cesare?
It's perfect pronunciation.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, so it sounds like we're good to continue moving forward. Just test and documentation. And I subscribe to this one as well, so I'll go back over it and review it as you update it.
Okay, awesome.
Thank you for raising it. Good timing considering the code freeze.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. All right, Antonio, service pod sitter configuration. We're down to 2 options. I actually read this one a little bit ago.
Yeah, so this is we went through the big debate. Dan and I also meet with people in QCon in Amsterdam. There was no much interest from people outside of networking, and I reduced the scope to 2 problems, right? Or we create a singleton object that defines the service and pod sider, and we can cross-validate in that object, but has the downside of people need to deal with updates and can break the cluster without not knowing it.
Antonio,
Hey.
I don't know if everybody's up to speed. Is it worth spending 45 seconds giving the problem statement?
Okay, sure. Okay, so the problem statement is like this. Right now, we have a pod network that use the node. No, some clusters have a pod network that use the node IPAN that is in the queue controller manager. So that's a very basic IPAN that just assigns split one super subnet into small subnets and assign this subnet to the nodes in the node spec pod side. This had a cap to be able to span this range dynamically, so people can add new nodes and add new subnets, and this way they can consume this subnet to allocate new nodes without having to restart the queue controller manager and avoid disruption on the cluster. In parallel, we have the other cap that was doing the same with service, so people can resize the service sider dynamically. When we realized that these 2 caps were going in parallel, Cal flagged the problem of, oh, what happens if somebody defines a cider that overlaps between pods and services? And okay, that's a problem. And we need to decide how do we want to solve the problem. What happens if people overlap subnets in this configuration? The problem with the API...
Specifically, we allow that via flags, right? We have an explicit capability to do that via flags for historical reasons. And so what do we do if people do that with these APIs?
We have that for pod sider, right? Via flag, right? But we don't have that for the new API with cluster siders. Okay, yes, we do via flag. Okay. Right. So now I lost him. I lost the. So the question, the question right now is, how critical is this problem and how do we solve it? Because API machinery doesn't allow to say to cross-validate. So if you create a cluster sider, you cannot go in the API server and check, oh, what service siders do I have, and I see if overlaps. So that's not possible. The other alternative is to do some kind of provision volume claims that was super complex, and it was discarded in the first iteration. And the other two feasible iterations from the previous discussion is, okay, I create one object that has the configuration, so when somebody updates another new subnet, I can cross-validate with all the subnet in that object. And the other option is, I keep going with creating cluster siders and service siders, and I take the same approach that we are doing right now with services. If something is overlapping, I just flag it. I send events or warnings or put a status or something like that, and that's how the user can be informed that they have overlap. Yes, Dan.
So just thinking this now, we could have some sort of controller spec versus status pattern where you can create multiple network config objects with specs, and then some controller validates them and creates a status showing all of the ones that have been accepted. And so if you create an invalid one, it just doesn't get accepted into the status.
I thought that I put that in the first document, that I had a lot of pushback on the, then the people do a change and they need to check the status to see if it was applied.
It's not like people are adding new networks every like 10 minutes.
And are you expecting to have this mutable or not? Then
Challenge accepted.
I mean, Dan, my big fear is that people will start abusing this, but my argument, which is I think noted in the doc, is all the CIDRs within a cluster already have to exist in a larger context, and that larger context isn't represented anywhere in the cluster. There's nothing that we can do that prevents you from choosing a pod CIDR or a service CIDR that tramples on your corporate network and causing yourself problems. There's just nothing we can do to prevent that. And so I wonder if it's really worthwhile to jump through flaming hoops in order to prevent a tiny subset of the larger problem, as opposed to saying, don't do that. This is an admin level API, like you'd better do it with caution.
So for me, the key thing is this is not a configuration option. So this is not managing infrastructure, right? So we are just providing information for the infrastructure that the infrastructure can use. It's kind of hints, right? I mean, you can configure a network there, but nobody's guaranteeing that network is going to exist. That's more in the Magic multi-network case. This is a node IPAN and saying, okay, you have this super CIDR and this node is going to have this CIDR assigned. But there is no guarantee this node is going to have the network itself. And for services, it's the same. We are providing information. Then it's the kube proxy or like who has to provide the service.
It's not the same. Like we had talked about this at KubeCon, that for services, we own everything. Like we can provide a configuration object to say, I want additional service CIDRs. For the pod network, the network plugin owns that. And we shouldn't be providing an API to change the network. We should be providing an API to let the network plugin indicate how it has configured the network.
Yeah, but in this case, so this is about the node IPAN. Okay, we have the node IPAN in the queue controller manager, right? So what you are saying, the plugins can be doing right now that they can go to the node and patch the node.
But they can't reliably indicate, for instance, to kube proxy what the complete set of pod CIDRs is.
Yeah, that's the configuration. Okay, but that's the configuration.
I did just want to raise real quick that we're at the 15-minute mark. However, everything else on the thing is yours, Antonio. So it's just kind of up to you.
Yeah, I hijacked the session. So I think wants to talk.
So Dan, what you say is true in the strictest sense of what we have today, but in theory, the service implementation could be an external range that is managed with real load balancers instead of virtual IPs. Just nobody I know implements it that way, but they could, right? Or in fact, Metal LB uses real VIPs. So there could be network level programming that happens outside of our kube proxy purvey. So it is a representation of configuration. And for kube proxy, it's also the source of truth.
But I was talking about like Kube API server owns the service side or range or ranges. Like it assigns IPs out of them. And that is no part of core Kubernetes owns the cluster.
Oh, I see what you mean. Okay.
Network side or in
Yeah,
that
but
I wouldn't say
that's
owns
why-
though. I would say consumes. The API server consumes those ranges that we tell it about.
I feel like the API server is the source of truth on that. It's
If we add an API for it, it is no longer the source of truth. The source of truth is now the API.
but
but
the API server. Well, I mean, yeah. Maybe we
What
need
is
to
it?
discuss this more in the doc or something.
Maciek has the hand.
Yeah, I
wanted to
just
say
I
something.
think we just want to point out what Dan, what you just mentioned. Yeah, like say you said kube proxy has. I think today the problem with the service side, at least, is that it's only configurable through arguments in a command line, and basically there is no centralized config for that. But I think the proposal that Antonio shows solves this, right? It is then controlled through API, as you said, and question is whether we want to do that, but then at least it's centralized. I think that's the key of this whole thing, right? We have an API that explicitly defines this is the CIDR we want to use, and then everyone else then switches to that, right? So that gives us, like, of course, it's not going to happen immediately, but then we have the object, and then we have kube proxy or the library or what's not, then eventually read from that and do stuff based on that, right? That would be the final goal, right?
That's the point. I want to move the discussion from let's define how are we going to configure the network to the discussion to let's remove the flag configuration to an API driven configuration of these options, right? You configure the service sider and you configure the node IPAN flag sider. And this is why I want to focus the discussion there, because the other discussion is we are not going to finish in I mean, that's a Kubernetes 2.0 thing. It's how you dynamically configure this flag, and then people can use it or not.
I think we don't have an agreement on what problem we are solving.
That's why I created this network 2.0, this second document. This is the problems. I define exactly the problems that I want to solve. So the problem is people have clusters and they have flags forever, and they need to modify these flags. And these clusters depend on these features, on the node IPAN and the service side. Okay, there are hands, nobody speaks.
I think the problem statement is at its core, we're making it more difficult than it needs to be to change things that are reasonably changed. And we have done a poor job in the past at distinguishing the cluster provider, like in Google's case, it would be the GKE team, versus the cluster operator, which is the customer who bought that cluster, in our use cases. And I think the CIDRs that you use for this is actually a cluster operator problem, not a cluster provider problem. And so we should have API for it. And I think if we added, like went back to the pod CIDR KEP and added an accept clause like we have for network policy CIDR blocks, then we could model exactly what we have in flags. So the bootstrap would be trivial. And at that point, it becomes the cluster operator's domain, which I think is the right trade-off here.
So we can have a follow-up meeting of 1 hour just with the people interested to go deep into the detail, right?
Sounds like there's a
Next
lot more
week.
discussion to be had.
Yeah, and there is 2 more topics, and it's clear that we are not going to progress. So I'm going to send an email to the mailing list for setting up one meeting this week. Okay.
Sounds like a good follow-up. And then anybody else who is interested in any of that, it's right here in the doc is linked here. Please do feel free to jump into the conversation and put some comments down and look out for Antonio's upcoming email thread. Okay, the rest of it's still yours, Antonio. So at whatever pace you want to go through your.
Yeah, this is mostly targeting team, but because he's handling this and I don't know what's happening, or people start now to do crazy things with services with the 2 protocols in the same port, or we have like 1 per week of these bugs recently. But why? I cannot understand. I think that it was always the same, right?
I mean, it has always been the same. So what's changed recently, let me back up. There's 2 different issues that use all the same words, but in a slightly different order. One is when I apply a service that has 2 ports that use the same number in different protocols, it gets broken. And that's client-side apply, which uses the merge key, which is defined as port number, just port number, and it will silently merge them and pick one, right? Which is awful. But it's not really fixable because it's baked into clients, and it's very difficult to change that merge key. At least there's no trivial solution to this. And so we've generally said, like, yeah, don't use apply for services where you're changing ports. It's apply and edit are going to break in this way. There's a second issue, which is server-side apply has issues with pod ports, not service ports, but pod ports, which are defined again under specified in that their key is defined as port plus protocol, which we thought we got it right this time. And it turns out it's actually port plus protocol plus host port, because some crazy people out there expose the same port on different host ports. And we tried to take it away once and people complained. So it is now insufficient on the server side, and server side apply doesn't silently merge them and pick one, which would also be bad, but at least consistently bad. It instead fails all server-side apply operations, even ones that don't touch those fields. And so as controllers are converting to use server-side apply, they go and update the status of a pod, or worse, they try to delete it by updating the timestamp. And the server-side apply fails because the ports are defined in this non-unique way, because the server-side apply validates it against the merge key, and the validation code does not, and that causes server-side apply to explode. That problem is the one that Antoine is working on right now. Antoine and Joe Betts are trying to figure out a good way to make that less impactful. The first plan, I think, is only make it explode if you're touching the port in question, or touching the fields in question. There's about 7 other objects that have similar problems. It still explodes if you end up touching the ports. And so now we're thinking about how can we actually make it come close to doing the right thing, or at least fail with a better error, or fall back on something other than server-side apply. Different discussions. The client-side apply problem exists, and I still don't have an answer for it, unless we want to go hack into the server side of the patch logic with the strategic merge patch and handle it, which Antoine really does not want to do. But you know, if it keeps coming up, and it kind of does, it might be something we have to look at.
The last one is weird because it's just the opposite. Server side apply works and the other doesn't.
So server side apply works fine for services, and it breaks for pods. Client side is broken for services but works for pods.
Okay, good. We have the whole spectrum covered. Okay. Well,
And since everything is leaning towards server side now, like more and more things are adapting to server side, that was the priority to try to actually fix. Also, it's because we have more leverage there because it is all done server side. We can find ways to handle these cases without having to update all the clients in the world.
okay. So I think that this topic, I mean, I find it interesting because it's super complex.
It's super complicated, and fundamentally it comes down to, in my opinion, service being one of the oldest APIs. When patch support was added, so like imagine a time before patch was supported, patch was added, strategic merge patch was added, not a lot of thought was given into what is the key going to be here, what does it mean if we get that wrong, and so it happened, we got it wrong, and now we just are trying to live with the consequences of it.
Yeah. Well, last topic now that I have Alexander, because this is he's the main stakeholder. Lately is the load balancer key person. I'm hanging out with Casey and other CNI maintainers because the right now the kubelet network ready is I ask the container runtime, and the container runtime just check that there is a file there and say I'm ready. And I think that we can do better, and I'm asking to have some way of the container runtime to check the CNI with a more active polling or something like that. And we are coming up with this proposal of status. So the container runtime can do kind of a health check to the plugin. And the question that was raised during the last meeting is what happens with load balance? And honestly, I lost track, and I just wanted to know what happens when the network not ready condition go to false with the load balancer.
The existing network not ready condition that I understood was the fact that the CNI plugin hasn't written its config file on the node. Isn't that only possible the moment the CNI plugin starts? I mean, it feels like day zero type of issues, so to speak. So
yeah, but that's the problem, right? Because once the file is there, network is always ready. But the problem is that new plugins that do more stuff, they have a different life cycle. So you may upgrade only the CNI plugin, right? And then it goes down, but the network keeps going ready, and then pods keep being scheduled there, and there is no CNI or anything. So the pods are spinning around, and that's the problem that we want to solve. But what we don't realize is what happens. What we don't want is, but you cannot create new pods. Don't schedule more pods to this node because I'm not able to provide network. But the existing pods are okay. I mean, they are plugged to the network. So the load balancers should be able to keep working. And I don't know if we have this.
yeah, so what happens today is, well, the service proxy answers to the load balancer's probe. And in the case of kubeproxy, we do watch the node, so we could react to whatever condition we would like to add in the future. So if the CRI or the kubelet is able to probe the CNI for this status and set a status condition on the node object, then kubeproxy could pick that up and start failing the LB health check to drain traffic away. So it wouldn't kill all existing ones, but it would block the new connections from happening. So it would have this kind of draining mechanism.
No, we don't, that's the opposite. We don't want the load balancer to stop working.
Okay.
So and you say that that's happening today, right? The load balancer will keep working.
The load balancer today will, I mean, in the case of external traffic policy cluster, the load balancer will continue to send the node traffic while kubeproxy's ready-z is okay, reports the status of okay or green, right? Well, so, I mean, this is, for the time being, there is no involvement with regards to like the CNI plugin's state. It doesn't impact load balancers.
We are at time, so is there a follow-up we can do here for you, Antonio?
No, I just wanted to raise this topic because this is happening, and I mean, the more people, and we started to know the problem that we want to solve, but then all these things are starting to pop up, and I'm not sure, how this is going to cascade.
Well, we could coordinate if you want. No problem.
We are meeting on Mondays on the CNI meeting. I cannot the link here.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll subscribe to that one and just take a look, and then anybody else who's interested, catch up with Antonio. It sounds like he's starting to follow along, or he's following along here and has some thoughts on the subject. Otherwise, it looks like we're out of time for the week. Thank you, everybody. Until next time.